Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fourth night of the Allen Family Residency at Texas Tech and virtually wherever you are. This presentation is brought to you by the Terry and Joe Harvey Allen Center for Creative Studies, and this webinar is being recorded. Tonight, Bukka Allen, producing music in the time of COVID.
First and foremost, I grew up in California, and a lot of my friends at the time when I was in high school ended up going to college in California. And I was thinking about that at the time as well. I'd applied to a lot of different colleges and so forth. But I had done a series of recordings while I was in high school with Lloyd Maines in Lubbock. And ironically, that kind of helped create a path for me to end up going to college in Boston, and it was Berklee College of Music there. And those recordings enabled me to basically get a free education through that school. You know, I didn't know much about Berklee at the time. I just knew it was a really good music school, and that's what I was really into. I was also doing, while I was in high school, I was working on a lot of contemporary kind of music soundtracks. So I was doing all kinds of stuff that was just musically related, and I just kind of naturally gravitated towards that while I was, you know, when I was young, and decided that that's what I wanted to do once I went to college. And then once the money was available to go, it was kind of a done deal. So I decided to go to Berklee. That in itself was an entirely diverse journey from year to year while I was at Berklee. I think single-handedly the most important thing that happened to me while I was there was being able to feel comfortable and finally find a group of musicians that I was able to connect to and learn how to play music with. That was probably the biggest thing that I was able to start learning about, was the idea of connecting to someone else's musicality and be able to find a home of my own as a player while I was playing with a drummer or a bass player or a guitar player. And the process of finding those people took a long time. Berklee was a really intense jazz school. When I was there, this was quite a long time ago, so it was still really focused on jazz music. And I loved jazz, but it wasn't primarily where I was coming from. I grew up in a household where I was listening to a lot of songwriters and rock and roll and pop and blues and soul music. So a lot of my playing stems from that, and learning how to play off of records and so forth. And I finally found a group of people that were at Berklee that were doing the same thing, and we created a band. And that band single-handedly probably kept me in school, because we were able to play gigs, have a great time doing what we love to do, make a little bit of money, and get a college education at the same time, you know. But I think the irony of doing, you know, being in any school that's dealing with creative arts, if you're not actually doing it somehow, it can start being counterproductive. So the first thing I wanted to do while I was in Boston was actually try to connect to folks and start making music. And it was great for that, because there were so many kids that were there for the same purpose. And when I think about all these friends of mine that I still have relationships with and I still make music with from time to time, in terms of recording or working on records, it basically boiled down to the simple fact that these people were into the same music that I was into. You know, just kind of stepping foot into a serious jazz school. I mean, I was listening to a lot of new wave music. I was listening to a lot of songwriters. You know, it's like I was trying to turn people on to people ranging from, you know, Townes Van Zandt to the Talking Heads, you know, a huge span of music, but it wasn't focused on jazz, although I did end up learning a tremendous amount of jazz and developed an incredible appreciation for it. At the time, I was just looking for people that I could connect with musically, and that was usually through taste, you know. And I mean, I literally remember meeting one of my friends, seeing him sitting in a hallway, and he had his Sony Walkman headphones, which is like inconceivable now, with a cassette tape. And I asked him what he was listening to, and he was listening to Pale Blue Eyes by Lou Reed. And it was like, I love that song. And that's how our friendship was spawned, you know. And almost all my friends that I ended up developing a strong relationship with, some sort of story like that took place, you know. And then we started creating music together. The other thing I was doing, which I continue to do, is I was always writing my own music. So I was wanting to find people that I could connect with to help me put a band together to perform these songs. I think it's important to try to set a schedule for yourself. I mean, I remember it, you know, as redundant as that may sound, it's like, I think it's really important to kind of delegate time and put focus towards certain elements that you're interested in throughout the day. That was such an interesting time in my life because I was so dedicated to learning how to play and trying to figure out how to get decent enough to understand the language of music to the point to where I could explain it to someone that might be able to, you know, help me out in a sense. You know, I think that so I would literally just set aside time. You know, it's like I would do stuff, dedicate the first couple hours of my day to practicing, then dedicate some time to my schoolwork that needed to be done, and then the rest of the time, my free time, was all spent towards making music or being around musicians or artists. My brother was in Boston as well, and he was going to art school, so there's this incredible mix and flow between artists and musicians, and it, you know, that connection is invaluable too, especially with film and so forth, where you can start making connections to both worlds because they both rely on one another. You know, it's interesting. It's like you talk. I'm teaching school now, and one thing that I think is so crucial is to remain open to your community, and open to the idea of collaboration, and being curious enough to step outside of what you may be obsessed with in terms of whether it's music or filmmaking or not, and realize that there may be someone else that can help you with the function of what you're trying to do that may create a whole new life. You know, in other words, if you're into soundtracks, you're going to have to work with a filmmaker, and vice versa, you know. So that's the beautiful thing about school, is then you have this pool of people that are interested in the same thing, and then you can kind of just navigate through to the point of finding some sort of connection. I think music to me is, you know, without getting into anything that feels too kind of unearthly, I guess you would say, but the single-handedly most important thing that has driven my desire for playing music is the connection that it creates with other people. First and foremost, when I'm playing with other musicians, that connection is almost unexplainable when it works. And then you have the connection between that working and connecting to an audience, you know, which is a fascinating thing in itself. But I guess to simplify it, it is really one of the most spiritual things I've ever done, and that's what keeps me going. It's the spiritual element of my life, and you can't really have that unless you're open to making connections. So I cannot encourage or endorse more the idea of forming connections with your community and embracing that, and knowing that there's potential incredible value to it. You may not think so at the time, but suddenly you may be in a collaborative situation where you're creating something that becomes unique and may get recognized and spawn you into an entirely different direction. And that's invaluable, you know, as in terms of being a student, and the idea of being a student is to be open to learning and open to your environment. So it's like embrace it and bring it in. One thing that I think that's happening right now that I think is really discouraging is the idea of how everything right now is online because of COVID. Suddenly a lot of these connections that we've been used to and this availability to our community is shut down. And you know, I've had my moments where I think about it and I get fairly depressed about it, because so much of what I do and so much of what I care about relies upon that. And that's one element of it. what I try to encourage when I'm teaching my classes is the idea to remain open to your community, create groups, create Facebook groups, create online platforms, create communication. Don't be afraid to communicate with one another. Keep that line open, because that's where projects can get developed and that's where the growth can take place, you know. And it's hard right now, but I do think if there's one group of folks that can make things, that can change the way structures are formed, it's a creative community. Because I really do believe that as time goes on, I think we'll eventually get out from under this, but in the process, as time goes on, we're going to figure out a lot of ways to do this kind of communicating and connection that's unbeknownst to us right now. But I highly encourage doing that. I think it's really interesting. I think once you get over the idea that there's been some sort of an amputation to what you do, if you're a real performer and that's what you've relied on for any length of time, that's unavailable right now. And for me personally, it feels like an amputation. It feels like a huge part of what I do and what I enjoy to do, and quite frankly, what was a large part of my income has vanished. But what I'm noticing is that people are trying really hard to start adapting. And, you know, some examples of that for me, it's like, first of all, recording hasn't stopped, which is really great. I'm noticing a lot of people are still recording and actually trying to compile as much music as they can to where when COVID lets up, they can release it. And it also is giving everyone time to kind of restructure and be able to put a record out, you know. Now, I could go into real specifics. I've done, you know, the live interaction is just not available right now. So what a lot of people are doing are these, you know, live streaming events that can be really interesting if they're put together well. One thing that I've been involved with, I've been doing a lot of videos with a lot of different musicians that support records that I've worked on. A good example of that, a band that I worked with for many years called the Bodines. It's really amazing what Kurt Newman, who's one of the founders of the band, is doing. He's retracking basically his entire catalog so that he can, I mean, there's a lot of different purposes for that, but he's basically kind of reestablishing his rights to his music so he can license this and still have ownership of everything. But he's recutting his entire catalog, and he's making these beautiful recordings of every song, and every week is releasing a new video to it. So over this COVID time, not only is he being productive and making records worth of materials, but he's also becoming a hell of a director. He's starting to make these videos for every week, and he's put out, I think, about 30 of them at this point. And I really admire that, because he's just staying really creative and simultaneously being able to release this, keep connections with his fan base, while at the same time he's creating basically a catalog of music that he can re-release as its own entity. So people are starting to kind of reevaluate, rethink things. I did a record with Eliza Gilkinson that came out in 2020. Ironically, the record is called 2020, so it had to come out in 2020. Eliza, for those of you who don't know Eliza, she's just a fabulous folk singer-songwriter, and I love her and I love her music. But we recorded this record just before COVID hit. But she was in a situation where she was trying to get the record out before the election. It's got a pretty significant political stance, and it's called 2020. But ironically, when COVID hit, suddenly the political juxtapositioning shifted, and every song became more about the COVID crisis than it did about the political crisis. It was like a statement for what we were going through. But with her record label, you know, what was she supposed to do? It's like, I've got to put this record out called 2020. And so she did, and her record label did put it out. And ironically, it's getting enough attention to where I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up getting, you know, nominated for a Grammy, because it's such a clear, defined statement on what we're all going through. And but subsequently, she has been doing the same thing, making videos, bringing different people in from all over the country to to work, like when, you know, she did some overdubs where she was able to bring in people that she admired or wanted to work with. And that's another thing that's interesting about COVID, is that people need to be, because people are craving connection, there's an opportunity to be able to call upon people that you normally might not be able to work with, because everyone is available, you know, and also people are more susceptible to agree to doing it if they're interested in it, because everyone wants to be working. So she did a record, you know, that I was involved with.
We're gonna walk together with every color and track.
I don't think ever once before I've gone into a session, I don't think pre-COVID and COVID my mentality had changed at all. I think it's just it's rather simple. Everyone's careful when we go into the studio. The one thing that has changed is there's not so much tracking with full bands, although that's starting to happen a little bit more. But it was just a matter of everyone having a simple conversation beforehand, like, the sessions run the same, you know? It's not that uncomfortable to have a mask on while you play the piano or any instrument if you're in the studio. And if you did start to get uncomfortable, you'd step outside and take a little break. But everyone's been real conscientious of it, you know? That's the one thing, that's another thing that's starting to take place that I noticed not only in sessions, but mainly in work, any kind of work environment, is that COVID's exposing an awful lot of things, you know, and if there's one thing that it could help us all do, is actually make tighter, stronger connections. And even having the conversation before I go into a session of like, hey man, can you make sure that so-and-so has a mask on because they're worried about being sick? Some people are uncomfortable about talking about that, you know. There's obviously different viewpoints of how people think about this, and bottom line, at the end of the day, people need to respect and take care of one another. And the objective of all this work that I'm talking about that is taking place in studios, the end outcome and primary, you know, is obviously the music, but the primary focus is we're doing is to make sure everyone walks out and doesn't get sick. That's what's kind of tricky right now, because normally you can have, you know, you have physical contact with people, so it's a little bit trickier now. What I would really, really recommend for all of y'all that are in Zoom meetings or classes or anything like that is pay extra attention to what other people are saying around you. I mean, you usually, hopefully you have a pretty good sense of what you're after and what you're going towards, but pay close attention to what those are saying around you, because you might hear something of interest. And at that point, when something sparks, do not hesitate to reach out to that person and create a line of communication. That's very easy to do with all the technology right now, but to establish that relationship, you may not be able to go, hey, let's go have a cup of coffee and talk about this, which is the way I like to meet people. But since we can't do that, it's paying extra attention and then making the extra effort to reach out and actually try to make that connection. And that's one thing that I think teachers can do. I think teachers can really encourage that because of the lack of physical connection right now. I think it's really important that we encourage our students to make those connections and to pay attention to anything that might create something new or a new possibility. You know, I talk about that a lot with my students. We usually, first day of class, we usually just have a real open discussion, and it's one of my favorite classes with them, and I give every student the opportunity to introduce themselves and to talk about what they like and to talk about why they're sitting where they are right now. And it's amazing just by those conversations how much you can learn from someone else. And you know, it's interesting because, you know, obviously there's people that, you know, are producing things, and then you have players, and then you have people that are more interested in the business side of music. And just to hear someone talk about themselves, suddenly one platform could become available to another, where, you know, who knows, this person that's interested in music business suddenly can help out this artist who's trying to get their songs out. You know, and the fact is that I cannot encourage enough the idea of trying to stay connected, you know, and that's what it's all about right now during this time. And then, you know, once COVID's out, then you guys can actually start doing stuff. And you can also create via online. It's a little trickier, but you can do it and start. I have a lot of students that are actually working on projects that they've developed relationships with musicians that live elsewhere, and they just exchange tracks and build stuff. And that's the advantage you guys have now, is that the technology is amazing. You can work on something and send it to anyone else, but it's mainly paying attention to what your interests are and then how someone else might be able to help that in some way, or where you can help each other to create some projects that could be really interesting, you know?
Hey everyone, we are back with Bukka Allen, and this is supplemental to the talk you just heard, where Bukka really walked through what it's like to be a student in that college experience in the music world. And where we want to go with this is to dive more into his career and as a working musician, sort of how he got his start, and then continue to build that resume up. And so Bukka, let's start there. You know, let's start with that idea of, you got out of college, you graduated, you had some of those relationships, but they were students too. How did you start to make your way on the professional side of things? Maybe how you analyzed the situation and sort of looked out to see how you could get hired and start working as a musician.
Yeah, I mean, that was a really big moment in my life where I actually decided to pack up a U-Haul and move to Austin, Texas. And it took me a little while to actually finalize that decision. You know, I mean, when I was in Boston, you know, I wasn't sure. I knew I wanted to play music, and I knew I wanted to find something that I could connect to musically speaking, you know, find musicians that were my age and kind of get into a vibrant scene. And, you know, at the time I was real interested in theater as well. And that kind of was off the cuffs of, do you know what your children are tonight? Because I really loved doing that experience. And at the same time, I had, because of some of the theater stuff that my folks were involved in as well, I had gotten connected to Minneapolis. I liked Minneapolis a lot. And there were basically two cities that I was thinking about as soon as I got out of school. It was Minneapolis and Austin. And literally, the reason Austin came into basically what was attractive to me was that I had seen an article on a guitar player who, you know, they did a little profile on it. I can't even remember what the magazine was, but there was a photograph of downtown Austin, and it had the Colorado running through it. And at the time, I didn't realize that the Colorado River ran through downtown, you know. And having been in Boston, one of my favorite things about the city was being able to go down to the river in Boston and just walk that river. So there was some real pull about just that photograph of water running through the downtown that I was really attracted to. And also it had a really great reputation that was brewing from its music scene. You know, I mean, I knew Stevie Ray Vaughan was from there and so forth. And I knew that, you know, the Fabulous T-Birds and Will and Charlie Sexton, there's some musicians that I had heard about, and Ely was from there. Ely I actually knew through my dad over the course of many years. Ely would come to California when we were in Fresno, and I got to know him. But, you know, so I knew of Austin a little bit, but I think the real pull was the weather and the river running through the middle of the city, you know? And
it's not really connected to the idea of, like, you know, you saw a want ad or a classified. It's like it was more internal. It was more like the things that were attractive to you and your spirit and your person, rather than, oh, it seemed like a great place to find work.
Yeah. I mean, it also had a really good reputation for music, where Minneapolis was more the theater scene is what I really liked about Minneapolis. And ironically, some of my best friends to this day live in Minneapolis, which is that I've played music with quite a lot over the years. But yeah, I mean, I think I just remember, and I had seen Stevie Vaughan play. I saw him play in Rockport, Maine. I went up there with some good friends of mine. And we just saw, he was doing a tour of minor league ballparks, and we saw this just remarkable show that was that he performed up there. And the energy of the show and the energy of that kind of music that was coming out of Texas at the time was something I was into back then, a lot. And I just remember thinking, I'll give this a shot. And I literally my idea was to go from city to city until I found a place where I felt like I could work and that I liked and enjoyed, and Austin was my first choice, and I've been here ever since,
That and you had such a well-rounded experience from working on theater pieces with your parents and also on your own, and then going to school and then being in a band, recording your own music, but then also recording with others. What were some of the first professional jobs that you got that sort of helped guide you or helped you decide, okay, these are the types of things that I want to be doing to not only, scratch that artistic side, but then also professionally to be able to make it in the industry?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll never forget going out to Ely's house one night. Joe was really the only musician I knew. And at the time, Joe was like, his band was one of the best bands I'd ever seen, and I went up to Joe's one day just to see him. And there's a guy named Bill Carter who was out there. And Bill is a great songwriter and had in fact written Crossfire for Stevie Vaughan. That was one of his songs, and had written a number of songs for the T-Birds and Stevie Ray Vaughan. And Bill was just there, and I met him, and I really, really liked him right off the bat. And, he was extraordinarily warm. He was older than I was, but he made me feel at ease, and he made me feel like comfortable enough to just kind of ask him as much as I possibly could about Austin. But I basically asked Bill, I just said, I just moved to town. I'd like to meet some guys my own age. And is there anyone that you would recommend me calling? And he gave me a handful of phone numbers of guys that were my age that were playing music that he liked. And I made a round of phone calls. I'm still good friends with all these guys, but the person who was the most receptive was Will Sexton. And I called him up, and he's like, that sounds great. Why don't you come meet me at the Texas Chili Parlor? And I did. And literally, I felt like I met one of my closest friends in an instant by one phone call. We went there, and we've been friends since that moment forward. But we were real tight for a long time when I first moved to Austin. But anyway, we were talking, and I can't remember the sequence of time, but it was quick. I think I'd been in Austin maybe a month or two. And Will and I hooked up at the Chili Parlor and ended up writing a song that night at where I was living. I had my piano set up, and we started playing music. And then Will hadn't mentioned it until like a day later, but he goes, well, I'm in the middle of tracking a record right now. You want to come in and play on it? Or, I'm getting ready to track. I've tracked some of it. And that was the first gig that I had. And it was a great gig because I had gotten a job right when I came to town. I was working at the Hyatt Hotel, working the early morning shift. It was hell getting up at 5 a.m. because I would literally work, go home, take a nap, and then hit the clubs trying to find music that I liked and just see what was going on. And I was like 22 at the time, so I was running full throttle. But yeah, Will had a decent, a really nice record deal, and it was a big paying gig for me. It was enough money at the time to where I was able to quit my job immediately and just and it gave me enough leeway to have about 6 months to just really go after trying to make it work out, and fortunately it did. But, another thing that I'm a firm believer in is a lot of really great work that starts to bubble from different regions of the country have a tendency normally to come from places that are easy to live, as far as, they're reasonable. You can afford to live there. And Austin back then was just like that. I mean, I can make 3 months rent in one weekend after about a year being in Austin. You know, that is not the case now at all. Yeah. But I've found that most really vibrant music scenes or artistic scenes come from kind of repressed economies in cities, because that's where artists and musicians have a tendency to gravitate towards, because they can work without being completely fearful of starving any given second, you know. And Austin was like that back then. Austin, this was in the early 90s, and you could get you know, it's like I rented a house for $400 with bail, and money wasn't something I had to worry about back then, which was an incredible, you know, because of that fact, it gave us an avenue to be able to work and focus on our work all the time, you know, and it just kind of started building from there. When I worked on that record with Will, I think it was tracked over the course of 2 or 3 months. It was back when there were still budgets that were available for records to be made for them, that were, you know, that was pretty common.
Yeah.
And so not only was I able to make enough money to live for a while, but I also, during the course of that record, met just about every fantastic musician that was in Austin, because they all came in at one time or another to play on the record, you know. Yeah. So that was an incredible moment for me, because not only was I working on something that I really, really liked, and, you know, musically with Will, but I was also able to kind of just meet a lot of my idols in a lot of ways, and immediately start working with them.
Yeah. And what, so what would be some tips then, or what would be some advice or your insight then to making sure, you know, I imagine, and I am no musician, but I imagine there's, you know, that creative pool to be yourself and to make your own music. But then when you're adding to someone else's vision, you really have to listen and respond, and to be able to creatively give to what they want to see, not necessarily what you see. And that probably helps you then get more jobs, right? Because then the reputation is Bukka's really great to work with, and he really helped, you know.
Yeah, that has a lot to do with it. It has a lot. It always just goes back to connection. You know, I mean, if you connect with someone, generally speaking, like when I'm in a session, I'm not so much, you know, we might change things in the studio, but I usually know that I'm there for a reason to come up with something that's a reflection of myself as well. If you step in front of any musician that you admire or that's good in any way, you're going to walk away learning something, you know. Sessions, I mean, it's like, they're all just, they're really different from session to session, but the commonality, all the great sessions that I've ever worked on have an element of generosity to them.
Yeah. You know, one thing I think that's interesting now, you know, we've kind of talked about early stuff in your career. I know that when you're just getting started, other artists and filmmakers and musicians that I know, you say yes to a lot of things because you just want to work, right? Where are you now in that journey? Are there only, like, I'm sure you get asked to do a lot more than you actually do because of all kinds of reasons. Maybe you want to spend time for yourself, or you know, those.
Well, I learned a lot of lessons from just that. I learned, you know, early on, where there were a handful of records I got asked to play on that I may have been secretly kind of intimidated by, actually, you know. But I used the excuse of saying to myself, "Well, I'm not really into that music," you know. The reality was I was intimidated because I couldn't play it, really. So ironically, I ended up trying anyway. And some of those sessions where I was the most challenged musically, I learned the most from. The outcome may have not have been the best, my favorite record that I've played on. But I learned a tremendous amount from it, because now I learned to find my home in a situation that I wasn't necessarily comfortable with. So a lot of times, you know, most of the people I work with at this point, I know, and have long careers. So I'm able, you know, there's like a cycle of records being made, and you kind of end up working with a lot of the same people. But I always try to, like, if it's a band that I've never heard of, or someone that's a young band, what's happening now, because I'm getting older, I'm starting to get asked to play on these kids' band, you know, younger bands, and I don't know a lot of them. And, you know, I kind of, it's like I always ask the producer, hey, just send me a track or two. And if, you know what I do is if I like it immediately, I'm just really honest with it. Like, man, I like these guys. Hell yes, I'm going to help them out, you know? And I don't think about if I really don't like it, more than likely I'm not going to do it, you know? Every now and then, it's very rare that I find myself in a situation that I don't like. I've had things get crazy in the studio where the situation's like hard to take, but at the end of the day, man, it's usually because someone is being really anal, and at the end of the day, they're only trying to help the project too, you know? So it's like, which can be really good. And I've worked with bands in the studio where we've had big budgets where it's like, you know, we go into the studio for 5 months and work on a record. And this was more in the 90s when there was actually money to be burned, you know? And, but the irony of that was that those records, man, I mean, when you get in a room and you work with a group of musicians and, you know, it's sort of like a great team of sorts. It's like you could take 5 of the best basketball players in the world and put them up against someone like the Spurs or something. They're going to get their asses kicked every time because everyone learns where their place is, and you get to the point where you can start reading musicians really well and feeding off them. But, you know, it's like records like that where it's months to make and we're experimenting and we're recording and we're rehearsing. And then there's other records that are, you know, like I did, one of the most meticulous bands that I worked with were the Courtyard Hounds, which were Marty and Emily from the Dixie Chicks. And they're just incredible players with incredible ears, and also more meticulous about how things are presented in their music than I've probably more so than anyone I've worked with. And I can't help but to love that about them because they're so dedicated and adamant about getting things to the point where there's no room on the outside. It's just all on the inside, and deadly with unbelievable precision, it's executed, you know? Yeah. And you learn a lot from that too. I mean, that can be hard to do if you're trying to, like, a lot of my favorite playing is really, what I talk about is freeing myself and like if here's a section where I can take off, 9 times, like I'll be in the studio and I'll do a take or two, and maybe a solo section, I'll give you 3 or 4 takes, and they are radically different. Every one of them is different. But then when you're working with a band that's presenting something to the world that they want to be refined and presented the same way when it's a live performance, it's another type of skill set, you know? And I learned a lot from that, you know, and it's kind of like the best of both worlds in a way, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, you know, what are you working on now? What's going on? I know, you know, COVID aside, I know that's hard to just put aside, but like you mentioned you were experimenting with triads, which once again, we don't have to get deep into, but what are you working on, you know, right now as far as an album, just songs, just experimenting?
Yeah, I'm working on quite a bit actually. One thing I've decided to do again, which I haven't done, is I'm practicing. Because I'm home a lot. I'm not touring or anything like that. And I've kind of, you know, I have this very strange relationship with the piano. It's like it's just been this staple in my life, you know, but now that I've been home, I've been finding myself playing a lot and actually practicing for the first time in probably 20 years, where I'm really practicing, like really trying different things and going at different angles with things. So that's one thing I'm doing with COVID. I would never normally have time to do that. Yeah. I'm working on a handful of records right now that are about halfway done. And I'm getting ready to go in and record some new tracks on my stuff, is some new songs that I'm working on as well. So there's like a solo project that I'm working on, been dedicating a lot of time to that and writing. When I say practice, I'm working on these songs and sitting by myself and spending a lot of time putting some new music together. And then it's like I'm working on, I think I told you, I'm working on 3 or 4 different records right now that are being tracked here, you know, and they're all real different. I'm working with McMurtry. I just finished his record, but I think I'm going to go in and track a couple more tunes. It's not quite finished yet, but that's a really, really interesting record. And I've been working on, there's a record that I've in the middle of doing by an artist named Jeremy Nail, who I absolutely love. And I love recording with him because what he does is he really brings in these beautiful songs, and there's a core group of musicians. This is the third record we've worked on, and he just opens it up to very, very collective kind of way of making records. It's like we just work and play and mold and finally get to where we all feel good about something and track it, you know? Yeah. But I really like working with him, and I'm doing some stuff with that. I've got a record that's coming out that I did with Shannon McNally. That's a fantastic record. She did this kind of amazing, daring, beautiful record of, she sang all of Waylon Jennings songs. I don't know if you know Shannon's music, but Shannon's a great singer. And she has, I don't know, I think like 10 records out on her own name. But she also did a record with Dr. John called Small Town Talk. And it's all songs of Bobby Charles. And I mean, Dr. John's one of my favorite piano players in the world. So being able to work on this record, it's like, I know who she's been in the room with working. It's like, this is some serious business that she's got going. And ironically, that she's singing with my dad as well, and she's part of, just like Moby Dick, but like a lot of these people that are in that band also have their own careers, from Charlie to Shannon to me to Lloyd is working on tons of stuff, you know? So it's like everyone's doing a lot of different things, and that's a great example of how people through the years have interconnected and then all end up in a rehearsal room with my dad, you know, which is, you know, and a lot of that's generational too. It's like, that's what's so wonderful about it. It's like playing with him is phenomenal, because it's like the respect, it's like a passing of the torch in a way. It's like, Lord, like I was watching Lubbock on Everything being made when I was 10 years old. And Lloyd and Richard and Davis wasn't in the band at the time, but I remember seeing Davis when I was a little kid with a band called The Planets. And now the next generation is being incorporated with me and Shannon. And when Brian Stanford plays cello, that's who I had my production with. And Charlie Sexton, who I've done probably a dozen records with, you know. It's like, and those relationships, like my relationships that go back to my early days in Austin, a lot of my friends I introduced to my mom and dad. And then there was this merging, and there's such a mutual respect that the generational thing never really was an issue. You know, we just all got to know each other and try to make music when we can, you know?
That's incredible. Bukka, we are running short on time. Is there anything you want to leave us with, or anything else you want to point out or talk about is here in the last couple minutes?
Well, I think, you know, I've gone through this a couple of times, but I think I can't stress how important it is to open yourself up enough to really go for what you're attracted to and pay attention to it. You know, a lot of people get intimidated by that. A lot of people like Mason say, "Oh man, I don't feel like I belong with this group of people. You know, I'm not quite there yet." You know, try to set that aside, because what you'll find 9 times out of 10, when you admire someone, there's a reason that it's connecting to you. And 9 times out of 10, that reason is because you share something similar to that person. And it's amazing how open people are. What I've found over the course of time is that through all the records I've done, through all the musicians I've met, most case scenarios, as a musician gets older and is working, they become more and more generous. And that generosity is available to you. And you may find, I mean, everyone has a spark of that. Everyone's kind of trying to do their own thing at the same time, but everyone's also trying to learn, you know? So the only way you can learn is by being around an environment that can teach you something. So always pay attention to that. and always take the chance. Like if you're really serious about something, you know, for me, it's like, I love playing the piano. If there was a piano player I really admired, it's like, I want to get to know this guy, man. I want to learn something from this person. And, you know,
yeah,
usually that's how things get passed down, you know, and that includes your peers, because this is such a vibrant time in your life as a student. You know, to be a student is like, it's an interesting time because there's so many possibilities, and there's so much you can worry about if you want to, or like, how the hell am I going to do this? I'm going to do that. The first thing you can do for yourself is try to identify what you like and stay true to it. Just stay as true to it as you can, and not focus all the time, but be aware that your environment dictates an element of who you are. So it's like, if you are in a place where your environment, you're not feeling good about the people you're around or what they're doing work-wise or anything, you're not digging it, get out of it, and make sure you surround yourself with people that that you don't feel that way about, that you actually are inspired by and feel something for, and feel like you have something to learn. And that goes an awful long ways, you know, and you'll be surprised that if you follow that trajectory, that 20 years down the line, a lot of those people that you gravitated towards are still going to be friends in your life, you know?
Yeah.
And it's not the friendship. I mean, the friendship part is such a huge component too of what ends up happening in a lot of the sessions I do. I'm friends with a lot of these people. I mean, you know, that took years to develop, but once you get comfortable, and it becomes your community in a sense, and there's nothing stronger than that, you know?
Yeah.
It's exactly what's going to get us out of this hole. It's the community. It's not none of us individually. It's the community of us figuring out how to get out and scrape out from underneath this, so that we can all keep working and doing what we love to do, you know?
That's awesome. That's a beautiful way to end it.
Yeah, okay.
All right. Thanks, Bukka. Good evening. There he is, Bukka. What's going on, man?
Hey, Paul, how are you?
Doing good, doing really good. So first, I need to apologize to the audience, because if you've been with us every night, you've seen my facial hair go through some pretty drastic changes. And
Let me tell you, Paul, it's really good to look at you rather than look at myself.
Yeah. I'll find a little bit of everything in this time. So, Bukka, great stuff there. And I'm just going to start diving into some of these questions. We've had some really, really great questions come through, and I think for the sake of time, let's just get on to them. Todd Wolfson asks, in your writing and playing, what are some of the biggest changes you've seen in yourself?
Wow, Todd, that's a good one. Hi, Todd, by the way. I think there's quite a few changes, but there's also certain elements that have remained very, very much the same, that I can relate to myself the same way I did when I was 5 years old, in a certain way. The biggest changes that I can kind of see in myself and that I recognize are kind of how I've evolved out of different experiences. As I've gotten older, I've been able to experience a lot of different things, and I've been able to learn how to navigate through situations a little bit differently, you know? Whether that's for the better or worse, sometimes I'm not so sure, but I've learned a lot more. And as far as a songwriter, I think that all comes into play. But at the same time, when I sit down by myself at the piano, which I don't really approach how I sit down at the piano any differently than I did when I was 5 years old. And that is really the truth. It's like I try to sit down with an open mind. Can obviously play better now, and I obviously have a lot more knowledge about the instrument, but when I try to start something that's new, it's almost like a clean slate, and I almost try to go back to that feeling of being naive and open and curious about what is going to come next that's sitting in front of me. And my relationship with the piano, it really ebbs and flows, you know? It's like, you know, I haven't put a lot of thought into it, but it's probably the most significant relationship of outside of human beings that is in my life, because it's a relationship. It's like it beats me up. It makes me feel incredibly confident at times. It can be the most disappointing thing that I've ever faced. It's really interesting. And so in one sense, I've kind of maintained this childish element that I love in music, and that kind of open curiosity that comes with naivete to some degree, you know. But the reality is that over years of playing and working with so many musicians that I really love, and I've learned how to play. I'm probably a better player. I also have an ability. I have a little bit more confidence. I think generally speaking, that helps me personally. I don't try to display that much, but I think in my playing, I'm able to get to things quicker in the moment. I just think, you know, there's different avenues that I can reach towards, and I'm not afraid to be daring with my playing. And that's something that has literally taken me 50 years to get to. It's like, I'm finally 50 years later able to hit certain things that are really truly within the world of improv. And I'm not afraid to do that live anymore. And, you know, depending on the circumstance, those are the kind of situations I love to play in. When that works, that's so wonderful when that can work, you know. So it's a cross between years and years of knowledge and experience while trying to maintain these elements that I remember having when I was 5 years old.
I love that. Moving on, you'd mentioned Shannon McNally, and she's got a couple of really great questions for you that I think are really important. I think that, you know, over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, there's been a lot of reckoning in different industries in how we treat each other, how we treat fans, how we treat new artists, new musicians in all realms, and also that myth of the artist who needs drugs and alcohol to really push themselves to create great art. And so that's the context. But Shannon asks, what role do sex, drugs, and excess still play in rock and roll and in the creation of great art?
Well, it's always going to be there, because it kind of erases your inhibitions to a certain degree. You know, I mean, it's like there's two different ways to look at it. It's like I think music took a really big change just culturally as soon as the artist was expected to participate with their fan base, which is how music is operating right now. I mean, it's like you have to be connecting and you have to become one with your fan base, which I actually have a real hard time with personally. I was lucky that I was able to see kind of both sides, where I experienced a handful of years touring and stuff with rock and roll stars. And the reason that they were stars is because there was a mystique about them that no one could touch because it was private, you know. But I think a lot of times, especially when you're touring a lot, I mean, there's so many elements to what Shannon asked. For one, it can be really fun. All those things can be incredibly fun, and as long as you're not killing yourself doing it, you know. But what can happen, you know, and I think that it starts out because it kind of takes away your inhibitions. And rock and roll is a funny thing, you know. It's like, especially when you're touring, it can become a grind, and that's where it can get problematic, because once you are in a grind, I guess first you have rock and roll's great because you can put a mask on, and especially back when you weren't part of the fan base, where there was more of a mystique. But once that got old, there starts to become an internal battle of not really ever being seen for who you are, and you start drifting, you know. And I've experienced that myself. I did one tour in Europe, and we were just floating across Europe for 6 months, and I was really sick of the guy. We were playing great shows, and we were 4 guys in a tour bus moving, and I think I spent a good portion of that pretty high listening to Bob Dylan records, driving everyone crazy in the band. But it was just so I could tolerate getting through from day to day, you know. But I do think, you know, it's the energy of it too. There's a sexiness to it. There's an energy to rock and roll that is like, people want to associate it with the devil's music, whatever. I don't buy that for a second. But I think that there's an energy that's very seductive, and sex, drugs, and rock and roll contain that kind of energy.
Yeah. But then once it sort of permeates in your everyday life, or you start to use it to, escape the situation, that's when it becomes a problem for a musician or for an artist.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like you do it at first to kind of get rid of, get rid of your inhibitions, and then suddenly you're trapped and you've got to find yourself again, and you can't.
Yeah.
So that's where it gets problematic, and I've seen that happen too. I mean, I've seen that happen a lot with musicians, and it usually happens with guys that are road dogging it really hard, and I've played with a lot of bands. It's interesting. One thing I have noticed is most of those kind of addiction issues or flirtation with that insane side of rock and roll, it usually happens when you're younger. If you can survive it, most of the guys that I know that have survived it for any length of time, they kind of get through it. It either kills you or you stop, because you can't keep going for too long. I toured for a long time with Joe Walsh, and he was notorious for his addiction issues, and he's been clean for 20 years, and it's such a huge part of his life. And what he was mortified about was, he talked about it all the time. It was like he was terrified to get on stage and play sober, because he didn't know who he was as a sober man at the time. Wow. And but the irony was, he didn't lose a thing, but it took time to regain that confidence and to be able to face yourself when you've been dealing with something like that. He was a real advocate for addiction, for helping people, because he's survived. He's been clean for 20 years or whatever, but he's really an advocate for trying to help people with that, because he knows what it's all about.
Absolutely. And Shannon's next question is really connected to that one in a lot of ways, and I think this is helpful to add to this conversation. What are some red flags that signal jive or toxic situations that young musicians should be aware of?
I think every red flag that happens, if your intuition is speaking loud and clear that something doesn't feel right, it doesn't feel right. To me, that's how I try to gauge it. I think it's real important to follow your intuition, and especially in sessions, especially if you're dealing with people you don't know that well. You can sense it. I mean, there can be difficulties, and sometimes it ebbs and flows to where first you don't like someone, and you end up really liking them down the line. But especially with songs, I mean, it's like at this point, if I listen to a song and I don't like it, there's a reason I don't like it, and I can explain that. There's no reason to tear the person apart or anything like that. But at this point, I pretty much know what feels good to me, and I know what I like. And if I don't, and I think there's a way, if it's something that's small, in terms of like maybe it's a part that's being played in a song or something like that, then you can have really constructive conversations to get to a place that's better. That's again going to open communication. But if you're dealing with someone who thinks they have a great song and it's not, and it doesn't feel that way to you, there's, you can polish a turd all day long. It's not going to make it any better, And I think if you follow your instinct with that, it's really important. But I do think like the intricate work in the studio, a lot of times you can run into problems where you might not agree with someone right away, and then you work it out through communication, And it's interesting, like Shannon's record, we've laughed about it, but Shannon, this last record we did with her, which is fantastic, but it was tracked in Nashville, and it was tracked with a handful of wonderful musicians in Nashville, and I came in from Austin. But there was a little bit of tension between the Nashville way of making records and the way that I make records. And you could feel it in the room a little bit from everyone. And it took about a track and a half before that went out the window. But people try to work through things. But if it's an ugly situation, listen to your instinct. It's not going to change 9 times out of 10.
Yeah, absolutely. This is came in anonymously, but you had mentioned the generosity of Grace Sessions. Can you elaborate on this some? What's the one thing that the best artists you know, from Joe Walsh, James McMurtry, Ray Wiley Hubbard, etc., what's one thing they all do, and one thing that they do not do? So like I think they're asking like from the standpoint of like what makes them special or who they are or successful or great musicians. What's one thing that they do in
Well,
session?
I can say the one thing that is common is their ability to be generous to you as a player and as a participant in what you're trying to do with their music. That's definitely the case with those three artists. That's the case with all my favorite artists. That's the case with this last record of my dad's, just like Moby Dick, which is takes it even further. The thing about Joe, I'll kind of go into details with each one of them. The thing about Joe that was so beautiful was that when we went in, the first gigs we did were really, I mean, literally, he walked in the room, we rehearsed a day, and you could tell he was coming in to see if he even liked the situation. He liked it, and then he huddled everyone and said, I want you guys to play like you're 18 years old. I want you to remember that feeling and play. And that's what we did. And we had a great time. And then we went into very intense rehearsals for about a month. And what was interesting about him is he refined everything, really like hardcore. And once the band came together, it was a big band, it was like a 9-piece band. Once it got to that refined machine, he set everyone free. And I thought that was amazing. And there were elements of his set every night where it was like, you know, once we get to the bridge of this song, go. And every night it was different. And that is massive for an artist of his fan. I mean, he's got a huge fan base. So it's like, he loved that element of that live energy. And that's pretty generous when you're in front, you know, when he's, you know, that can fall on its face too. And it doesn't matter how good or bad the band is. If it's a bad night, it's not as good as a good night. So it's like, I like that. And that was something that I walked away with, but his playing and everything was remarkable. I learned a lot from him. I actually learned more about my piano playing with him, for some specific reasons, but than I have most musicians. He showed me some things that were really fascinating. McMurtry's music, it's his songs, man. His songs, to me, it's like I get caught up into his words and what he's saying and the stories that he's telling, and trying to find a way to uplift that story without destroying the subject matter of what's being said. A lot of musicians just have a tendency, not a lot, but sometimes you have a tendency to play to where you get in the way of the song. And McMurtry's such a great songwriter that when I go in with him, it's almost reduce, and find that thing that just lifts it in the perfect way, you know? And so for me, and he's generous about how we track. This last record we worked on, it was just him and I. We had it was interesting because the producer was in LA. So COVID was heavily involved in those sessions. And I was doing a lot of tracks and a lot of sending back and forth and stuff like that. And there's some miscommunication, but it all worked out. And through it all, James was as cool as can be. And I think you know, I come from the school where the song's got to come through. The music is kind of secondary in a lot of cases, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Got a personal question here. Sally writes in, what do you think is the most creative thing Crew, which is Bukka's son, has experienced or created himself as a result of COVID? I love that.
Wow, that's an amazing question, Sally. I think I could go on for about 7 hours with that one. I don't think there's a most. I think what's fascinating about it is that I'm watching Crew, his sense of curiosity and how he's starting to develop a real sense of himself and a sense of his place in the world. And he's starting to question things, and he's starting to form his opinions, and he's starting to express those things. And to me, that's the most beautiful thing. You know, it's like the other day he's doing online school, and you know, his class was fortunate enough to have a Zoom meeting with the newly elected mayor in Buda. And I got a phone call from his teacher 3 or 4 days later that she's like, this kid should be a reporter. You know, he's asking the mayor about how to improve the drainage system in town, what he thought should be done. What do you think of the water supply? He's very conscientious of what's going on. And I think that's another thing that's been interesting especially with the election and everything. I think these kids are, you know, they're getting fed so much information to begin with. But to watch him kind of walk through it all and there's like this incredible strength and vulnerability to him at the same time, and sweetness, but strength. And to me, if he can walk that line, that means the world to me, and to see him develop into a good person, you know, and I'm starting to see that. Yeah. That's the most creative thing. He is the most creative thing I've ever done in my life. Just like my mom said, there's no doubt.
What's that? Yeah.
No doubt. And I'm sure Sally would agree too.
That's great. That's great. So next question, how can a woman or people that are perceived to be gendered as a woman gain access without being subjected to sexual advances? How can women get an opportunity when men in the art world are sexist or subjugate us? And I think they're looking for basically the idea that it's a very macho world. There's a lot of men taking advantage of young women who are looking for opportunity. How does a woman navigate that world?
Well, I mean, that's a really interesting question posed towards me as a man. You know, I have many friends who are female artists who are wonderful, fantastic musicians, and I think every one of them has a horrible story to tell when it comes to that. You know, I think that if I were to experience that, whenever I'm personally experiencing something that feels like it is just basically, you know, putting me in a place where I feel humiliated to some degree, I try to get out of it. I try to leave as fast as I can and find another situation. Now, sometimes you can't, and that creates horrible situations, you know. I think one thing that is happening that is really good to keep that kind of crap at bay is the Me Too movement. I think it's been an amazing, you know, I think it's ever been as important as the Black Lives Matter movement. I think what it does is enables you to kind of take a look and reflect and actually see how culture has been kind of operating in certain ways. And now you have the opportunity to kind of dissect it and challenge even your own belief systems sometimes, or what you're used to. But that's something, I mean, personally, I would never tolerate anything like that, personally. And I haven't been around many situations where that happens. I have been in situations where there's a lot of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And for the most part, it's very consensual, you know. It's as soon as it's not, that's where it just turns very ugly and something I'm not interested in. You know, yeah. But I do think there's more of an avenue. I think people are paying more attention to it. I think that there's a spotlight on it. So I think that some of that crap that might have been a lot more common at one time is a little less common now. And so that's a good thing. All these movements are good things in terms of helping people feel comfortable with themselves. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. What do you most want to accomplish as an artist in the next phase of your life, and who would you most like to work with that you haven't yet?
You know, I mean, that kind of changes for me a lot. You know, it's like I know I'll continue to play music. You know, there's a few things that I really want to do. I want to make some more records of my own, and I also would like to do some more touring. That's with a really good band, you know.
Yeah.
I haven't toured a whole lot lately, and I've been really good with that, but it's something that was such a huge part of my life. I mean, I literally toured from the time I was 22 until I was about 44, 45 years old. And for many of those years, it was 300 days a year. So I was on the road a lot, supporting, and in different ways, from touring in a van to, I mean, literally I've experienced every kind of way of touring, from vans and trailers to Learjets, so it's like, but I would like to be involved with another band that's just doing really well. COVID, that band was my dad's. I mean, it's like we were playing a lot. COVID just kind of put a stranglehold on everything, But I miss elements of that. And sometimes when I start missing it, then I don't. It's like it goes back and forth. But I'm always going to be playing. I mean, literally, one thing that's been really interesting about COVID is the relationship that I have with making music in my room is not going to stop no matter what. Now, wherever that takes me, we'll see what happens. But it's like, I've never been one to like push that. I've been a little bit more malleable in letting things kind of happen. And then I've never tried to go out and get something. It's just funny how things kind of and that's what I mean by connections. It's like the music world's pretty small, and I've never been one to hustle. I've never been one to try to land the big gig, whatever that means. I've always just tried to keep myself open and be really true with whatever I'm doing, whether it's in support of another musician working on a record or working on my own music.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you keep your momentum and enthusiasm alive when you hit a writer's block? How do you go about finding new inspiration?
Man, that's a tough one. One thing I still do, I listen a lot. I listen to music. I still listen to music all the time. I'm still fascinated by it. I'm still curious about it. I'm still trying to find stuff that moves me. And when, it's, that comes and goes, those waves of inspiration. I always try, I'm constantly working on ideas, and the way I work, a lot of times I'm literally like today, I've got 5 voice memos of sitting down, little melodic phrase, done. I've got another memo of Yo-Yo Ma playing a little melodic piece that I absolutely thought was one of the most beautiful things I've heard this week. And little phrases and fragments all in my, I've got thousands of these things. And, but when I'm writing, I usually now really try to sit down, and if something does spark, I try to sit with it and finish it in the moment. I try to let it flow and get out of me, and then I might go back and refine it. But it's an interesting process. I think that, I think you have to be real open. I saw this amazing thing that I could relate to a little bit, where Randy Newman was doing an interview, and he's just talking about how he gets up every day and sits at the piano no matter what, And I don't so much schedule it like that, but I do sit at the piano every day. There's probably not a day since unless I don't have one around, there's not a day where I don't sit and dick around with it to some degree, And then if something hits or a phrase hits, I start working on it, I did see something, it's interesting, a lot of this streaming stuff, I have a hard time watching it because the production quality and the sound, and a lot of it's pretty bad. But there are some platforms that are doing some really nice stuff, where it's recorded better and shot better and that kind of thing. But I did see something the other night. It was the Tom Petty birthday streaming thing, and I saw a friend of mine actually was able to shoot it. He posted something like, "I shot this piece," and it was Ben Tench and Mike Campbell from Tom Petty's band, and they had not played together in 3 years. And Ben Tench sung a song, and man, I am telling you, it was one of the most beautiful, inspirational things I've seen since COVID. And when I got hit by it, I literally played the piano until the sun came up. Just sat down and started going. And it's like when that happens, it's just an energy surge, and you can't predict that, you know. So, but I'm always trying to listen and leave myself open to the possibilities, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are running short on time, and so I'm going to make this our last question. For those artists that someone admires and would like to learn more from, what would be your suggestion on how to approach them to ask for a mentorship or some other, you know, how do you approach someone you really admire who's making music and ask for their help?
I think it's just having the courage to do it. I think it's literally, you know, if you are actually in a place where you think and within yourself that you're ready to take on the energy of someone that you admire, then you should ask them and get the courage to do it. Because 9 times out of 10, if you ask that person in a sincere way and somewhat have your shit together, they're going to give back. And that was one thing that was amazing about Austin when I first moved here, was that I was very naive in certain ways, but I was very dedicated to just wanting to play music and wanting to meet people. And the thing that I noticed about Austin, and I think this is everywhere actually. I think if you have a sincerity about what you're wanting to learn and why, and you can ask the person that you're admiring, if there is a sincerity to it, they are going to respond. That's one thing I love about teaching, is that I've had, it's like mostly privately, when I'm teaching privately, these kids have reached out. And there's a reason that none of them, all of them are great musicians. All these private lessons that I'm doing, they're great musicians that have reached out to me, and some of them are young. Like one kid I'm working with is really great guitar player. He's 18 years old, and he reached out to me specifically to learn some things on piano. And it's like, man, if this kid's going to take the time to do this with me, that's a brave move. That's a brave move to do, and most people will recognize that. Now, if you're kind of full of it, you're not going to get anywhere. Period. It'll end quick, you know. Yep. But if you're sincere about it and have some legitimacy behind, it's not about experience, it's about conviction in what you're trying to do. I think you'd be shocked at how ready people are to respond, you know.
Absolutely. Bukka, such wonderful stuff tonight. Thank you so much
for
Paul. Your energy and your passion. It's always fun to get to sit and chat with you.
Thanks, Paul. Okay. Awesome. Bye, everyone in internet land.
That's right. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us on this night 4 of the Allen Family Residency. Remember, join us tomorrow night in our last night of the residency. If you've registered for any of these webinars, that same registration is good for all of the webinars. So you just need to click that link again tomorrow at 7:30, and we'll be sitting down and talking to the man whose grandchildren call him Papa Rat, Mr.
Y'all turn the TV on tomorrow. Good jokes.
So join us.
Yep. I love you guys.
Last night, and we'll see you. Have a great evening, and see you tomorrow night, 7:30.